Welcome back to Baltimore Birdwatchers. I'm Nikhil Mehta. With me, as always, is Daniel Rotter, back after a brief hiatus following the Orioles' disappointing end in the playoffs. But we are excited for this offseason. The last few off seasons have brought increasing amounts of excitement in Baltimore. I think last offseason was one of the most exciting in recent memory. And new ownership should hopefully mean more possibilities for this team. Daniel, how are you feeling a couple months after or month after the season's ended and staring down the offseason now?
Well, I'm pretty excited to get started with this offseason. I think that we're really negotiating from more of a position of power than we ever have before. Like you mentioned, we have this new ownership that essentially has bottomless pockets. That's what we've heard, and they've made it known that they want to win and they want to spend to win. So, I mean, from what I know, there's really no reason why we couldn't go out and get just about any free agent. It's just, do we have the motivation? Do we value our guys in house more? That there's just some variables that might get in the way, but any possibility, I think, is a non-zero chance of happening this offseason, except for maybe Soto, just because we don't seem to really be in the mix for him.
Yeah, and I just it that would just be such a weird departure from the way this team has built its lineup with all the young lefty bats. Don't get me wrong, I'm fully on board with the pursuit of Juan Soto. But it's not specifically need-wise what the lineup needs. Now, again, getting him is probably better than, your average righty bat that you might be able to sign for sure. But just given the money and the competition, it just doesn't feel likely. It would be really cool if the Orioles were a dark horse in that. It just doesn't seem like they will be. And the other thing is there isn't an Otani that, I guess Soto is the Otani of this year's free agency. And there really just aren't other really, really top level players like that out there that would be out of reach. And Oro showed a willingness to go out and trade for one of the best pitchers in the game during the offseason last year. So you know that guys that are on other teams right now aren't even technically untouchable with the prospects they have in the system. Wanted to go over the moves that the Orioles have already made to start the offseason. As expected, Anthony Santander, Corbin Burns, John Means, Brian McCann, among several others, all elected free agency. I don't think any of those were particularly surprising given their respective tenures with the team over the last couple of years. Um, a loud contingent of fans wants the team to re-sign Santander and or Burns, which I'm not sure either of those is going to happen. And then the Orioles released Danny Colome, Logan Webb, and Eloy Jimenez. Not surprising for them to let Jimenez walk with that big player, with that big contract that he's still attached to. But Danny Colome and Webb, I was a little surprised that they let both of those guys go. Neither of them were like, gotta keep them talents, but I was surprised that they let both go.
I wanted to start by saying I appreciated your Brian McCann shout there. A little bit of a
Oh,
misspoken
yeah.
name. I think he's on the Hall of Fame ballot this year. So classic catcher right there. Um, but no, I mean, I think that all of Birdland was a little bit surprised when we saw Coulomb and Webb both get released. I think a lot of us were very attached to Danny Coulomb because he was quite reliable this past year and really for the past couple of years as an Oriole. His K minus BB numbers were excellent last year, 25% strikeout minus walk rate, which is good. I think just what we're concerned about is the fact that I think he's mid 30s, like 35, 36. He missed a lot of time this past year, and he's not a hard thrower. So I think we kind of just struggle maybe to project that this sort of archetype is a definite to yield success again. And we think we might be able to maneuver the market to find a cheaper or a younger or a higher upside option than Coulomb. But certainly, I think he's a guy that will get another shot with a major league team. As far as Jacob Webb goes, he was all right. I mean, let's be honest. Jacob Webb was not anything super special. He was a decent bullpen piece for us, but we got him by picking him up off the scrap heap from the Angels, anyways. So it's not like we invested all this capital into him. I'm fine with letting him go. I mean, letting Coulomb and Webb both go just means that we're going to need to add to this bullpen externally through free agency. But I'm fine with it because it's not like we had, this stable of horses in the bullpen. Like it was, it was not really the best bullpen. So I'm okay with kind of trying to start over and see what we got. And then as far as Eloy Jimenez goes, yeah, there was no way that we are going to bring him back on that option after showing us so little and being a DH only type of player. So I know that Birdland has had a strong reaction to the bullpen moves, but they're not that good, is my thing. Like I can't react that strongly. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think if anything, both were pretty consistent and just the going into free agency with starting pitching and righty bat at the top of your wish list, you might I think the reason why most people were surprised, I think, is you would expect the team would want to keep around at least one of their two more consistent middle relievers. And not have to have relief pitching as a huge all-season need. Although I guess you could argue it already was, but now it's not only, some more top-end talent, it's also filling out the depth of the bullpen. So again, nothing too big to react to, but I would say just a minor surprise. As for what's next, the Orioles winter meetings are next week, right, Daniel?
Yeah, they start on Monday, I believe.
Okay. And then there's the Rule 5 draft, which, the Orioles have had found some gems a couple times in Anthony Santander, famously a Rule 5 pick. But it's, as always, it's a pretty limited talent pool. It's someone that they'd have to find that their metrics really like, that they have they project maybe a pitcher's development in the Orioles pitching lab. Other than that, obviously, there's just no big names in the Rule 5 draft, and it doesn't seem like the Orioles have any huge names of their own at risk either.
Yeah, I really don't even have a lot to say about the Rule 5 draft in advance. Nikhil and I were kind of talking about this, that it's so hard to predict what a team wants to do with an open 40-man roster spot. I mean, we might have our eyes on lots of free agents, and we might just choose not to participate because we don't want to, block any potential, moving parts on our 40-man. But I mean, there's options that we could look at for using this pick. Obviously, you could go for the arm with high velo, see if you can get a big ticket for nothing. Or maybe that's where we go to explore what our backup catcher option might be. We were talking about backup catcher a little bit at the before the start of the show, and we'll get a little bit more into it later. But there's some ideas for what we could do. But ultimately, I think at this point in time, it's best to temper expectations because we used it a lot in the rebuild, and it's easy to remember, the Drew Jacksons and the Max Roller stories of the Rule 5 draft where they just became nothing and were returned to their team within the first month of the season, which is usually the more likely outcome of the Rule 5 draft.
Exactly. I think it's one of those things that is because it has draft attached to it. I think there's just a little more made out of it than uh, it should be. But you mentioned obviously keeping 40-man roster spots open for free agency. And I think that is the big focus of Baltimore this year. The fan base is, as you mentioned, has an owner and that has the money to go out and compete with pretty much any team to sign anyone if he wants to. And that's something Baltimore hasn't had in I would say for our lifetimes. If I probably for our lifetimes or close to it. So what's interesting though is the maybe first big domino to fall might not be the biggest money move. Um, it could be Roki Sasaki, the Japanese pitcher. The Orioles have think a larger international bonus pool money than most other teams. I don't know if they're first, but they have among the most money in their international bonus pool, which means they can offer Sasaki one of the best financial packages. The question remains is if he wants to move to Baltimore, Maryland for his first Major League Baseball team.
And that's kind of what I've been getting at as far as, all the speculation on X about Roki Sasaki, because there is no more relevant engagement baiting happening on Orioles X right now than, oh, we got all this international bonus pool money. We could go sign Roki Sasaki. And it's like, sure, we could sign Roki Sasaki if he really is that, overwhelmed by a couple $100,000 extra dollars. But at the end of the day, a guy like this, I mean, he's probably got already a bunch of endorsements in Japan. And when he comes over here, he's only going to get more endorsements that will probably already out total whatever he's going to be getting paid formally by an MLB team. And like you were saying, what is the appeal for a star NPB player in Japan to come to Baltimore? We have like practically no history of Japanese players on the team recently. We had a half a season of Shintaro Fujinami, and then you mentioned we had Koji Uehara years ago, who I think might have been Japanese. Um, but there's just not really anybody in his corner that's probably going to vouch for us when he could go play with multiple teammates on the Dodgers. The Cubs have Shota Imanaga. I mean, there's just, appeal to other big baseball cities for him. And I just really have a hard time believing that the Orioles are going to land this next star Japanese pitcher just because I don't see the appeal of Baltimore, Maryland to somebody who's not from the United States. And it's really that simple. I know we have a good young core, but I highly, highly doubt he's going to put us at the top of his list because we have an extra couple $100,000 of bonus pool money.
Yeah, and I'm trying to check right now. I can't. The reports on Twitter are a little conflicting, but the Dodgers have a good amount of international bonus pool money too. So one of the arguably the top other contender is going to be able to give him close to the same amount of money. He'll be in LA. There's a larger Asian community on the West Coast, a larger Japanese community. That not only is big for him personally feeling at home, but also being in LA might give him a chance for more lucrative endorsements, whether that be in the U.S. or back in Japan. I just think that those factors make it tough. And like you said, there's no one to sell him on Baltimore. Baltimore hasn't had any spectacular success with international free agents lately, and so there's no reason for him to put us above the reigning World Series champions with Shohei Ohtani on them, for example. The pitch would be you are, you become the team's best starting pitcher, probably. You become the team's best starting pitcher, your opening day starter. You can make a huge impact and, be a pitcher that might be able to have a big enough impact to help the team in the playoffs, go to the World Series, all that you wouldn't be able to be the face of the, franchise push the same way you would in LA. Again, we also have Gunnar Henderson, Adley here that, there's not that much room on the marquee. Um, and obviously it's not allowed to promise a player an extension, during these negotiations. But the Orioles can also point to the obvious, which is they can very much afford a lucrative extension for Sasaki when he is eligible for one. They can, hint at that in the negotiation. And problem, of course, being so can the Dodgers, and the Dodgers are willing to. And so I agree. It would be really exciting, and I obviously they should make a strong push for it because making a strong push for it has a effect later on in future years when more players are like, hey, they're really trying to get international players. They're committed to this. It has an impact. So between that impact and the potential of possibly landing him, it's worth pursuing, but I just don't think it happens. Um,
As a
pitchers
front office, you have to do your due diligence for sure. I'm not saying that the Orioles shouldn't go after him. I'm saying I don't think he would necessarily want to come here. But absolutely, as Mike Elias in the front office, I mean, you're trying to pitch him as best you can. Hey, you're going to be the ace of our staff. You're going to be one of the faces of our franchise. You're going to be so beloved here in Baltimore, whereas in LA, you're just going to be another guy. Like, that's exactly what I'm sure we're trying to say to him. I just don't think he's going to be buying it.
Yes, agreed. And it's all things that are true, but it's just this specific set of factors. It's not like the Orioles like you said, it's a couple hundred K more, which in the long term for these guys does not make a difference. But it's also a test run and a test balloon, letting other international free agents in the future know that the Orioles are really going to be competitive in this market. Pitching is probably going to have to come from elsewhere, most likely free agency. There are, a number of pitchers out there, but of course, the pitching market, like it seems to every year, but I feel like between the deadline and the deal that came out today for Luis Severino, the last 6 months or 4 months of 5 months of pitcher valuation has really, really gone up. Between I think the Astros kind of kicked off a much more expensive round of trades at the deadline. And then this Severino deal just feels like an overpay, especially from, a notoriously frugal athletics franchise. Um, do you think the Orioles are going to be in the market for one of the top available names out there? Do you think they're going to be able to land or retain Burns or land one of the equally big names remaining, Max Fried, for example? Or do you think it's going to be kind of picking in, maybe the top of tier two of available pitchers?
I think the Orioles are going to inquire with just about every arm that's on the market. I know that big media has kind of already written us off on Corbin Burns, and just because he seems to be really the primary pivot from Juan Soto whenever he signed, which seems like it's going to be soon. So whatever teams of the Yankees, the Mets, the Red Sox, the Dodgers lose out on Soto, seems like they're all going to immediately turn their attention to Burns, and it seems like a lot of the big New York talking heads have kind of just assumed that we're not going to be able to compete with them monetarily. I definitely think that we could, and I think that we are motivated to keep him around. I don't know if we'll end up finding our valuation worth it as far as maybe pivoting to one of these other guys, like you said, because who knows what if the Mets get Juan Soto, who knows what the Yankees are going to want to throw to Corbin Burns just to compensate to their fans, right? So,
Yes.
I
Yeah.
just I don't know, but I don't see why we couldn't go after him. You were saying?
No, and I think that's the big thing is that, we've talked all year about Burns's K rate dipping. There are plenty of metrics out there that the Orioles love to use that might show, some regression that they might not want to commit to a super long, super big contract for a guy who, in some ways, regressed last year, even though, again, he was brilliant for most of the season. And like you said, you have those two big prizes of free agency this year in Soto and Burns, and between the Mets and the Dodgers and the Yankees, these teams that don't just have the money and will to win, but they have, way more media pressure to go out and spend and get these guys. The Dodgers are an interesting case because there should be less pressure because they have a loaded roster, but because they've shown they're willing in all these cases, then it's like, okay, why can't you add one more? And obviously the Yankees and the Mets in New York, where their fans are absolutely ravenous. We joke sometimes about Orioles fans, and their expectations and demands of the franchise, but really the scene here and the media scene here is nothing compared to the Vultures in New York. And so I think that's a really, really great point that no matter where Soto ends up, Burns becomes the pivot for all these teams that were willing to write, a 500 plus $1 million check. They can get Burns for cheaper than that and still appease their fan base by saying, well, look, we got the second best guy available. And the other really important point that you brought up is the whole issue of valuation, right? The Orioles front office is driven by value. And they have, I'm sure that their algorithms, their analysis has spit out a and I don't mean to say this is like the machines controlling the team. I'm just saying this is kind of how these models work, which is they spit out a number of valuation for the player, and then that's really what the Orioles try and use as a final point to get their contract as and in their negotiations. And the problem with doing that, and I guess adhering to that so tightly, is that when the pitcher market grows, like Severino got, what was it, 67 million over 3 years
Yeah,
today?
67
That
mil.
is that is just too much. I would be annoyed if the Orioles gave him that contract, for example. I would be like, what are we doing here? And but that is just a sign of where the pitcher market, how the pitching market's going to continue to grow, and you have to at some point determine how much over your valuation you're willing to go to secure the talent, given that it is a competitive market. And that it's not like you're going to the store to buy something and only if it's at your price because everyone else wants it and then they're going to use it against you. So I think it's unlikely they do that for Burns. But I do think once the Soto and Burns dominoes fall and they're looking at Freed is probably the maybe the top name for them that's still out there. That they need to pony up for it. They really need to go out and be willing to go above their valuation if they want to land the guy. I don't know, enough about Breed to really put a dollar figure on how much he's worth, but the philosophy should be, okay, we have our valuation, we know what we'd like to pay, but what are we willing to pay given the competitive market and the going rate for starting pitching?
There really are a whole slew of starting pitchers who are not Corbin Burns that are out there in free agency for us to look into. And I'm actually going to be writing a piece about this, so stay tuned into my X account at drod_6, talking about who is the Orioles' next ace. And so, look, the options outside of Burns, should we not bring him back? You mentioned Max Fried. I think Max Fried is going to get overpaid. I don't think that he necessarily has the stuff of a number one type of guy. I mean, he's durable. I don't want to call him a crafty lefty because that kind of insinuates there's no velo there, but he's not a high velo guy. He's not like an unbelievable, athlete necessarily either. He's a good pitcher. He's probably a number two on a good team, which there's other guys who kind of similarly fit that mold that I think that we would be able to get cheaper. Um, there's Jack Flaherty. I don't think he's coming back to Baltimore. He's one of those options. Sean Manaea is a really interesting one because he kind of revamped his career with the Mets last year by lowering his arm slot. He said he was trying to mimic a Chris Sale like delivery, and that worked wonders for him. I mean, when we faced the Mets this year, Sean Manaea absolutely dominated us, and that's
Yeah,
kind of
diced us
left a
up.
lasting image in my head about him. So I think he's certainly an intriguing arm. There's Nathan Eovaldi, who is a solid veteran piece who has been a part of a lot of good postseason teams. So I think that's an option. There's been some buzz about Shane Bieber. I don't love it just because I feel like he's fallen off so steeply since those couple good years he had around 2020, 2021. Like the velo has totally fallen off. Then he got Tommy John, and now we can't even expect him back until probably the second half of this year. So I feel like that's a little bit too big of a risk. Maybe if we get him for a huge kind of bargain, I could get behind it, but I'm not sure. And then lastly, the Red Sox did offer a qualifying offer to Nick Pivetta, and he declined it. So there would be that qualifying offer pick attached to him, which is a bit of a bummer, but it would perhaps make him a bit cheaper. He does have excellent strikeout rates, but has kind of never really put it all together to become an ace yet. So he might be the kind of guy that if we're willing to, get away from this tight grip that we have on our draft picks, maybe Nick Pivetta is a guy that we go after because we might be able to get him slightly discounted given the qualifying offers attached on like a 3-year deal. So there's a lot of guys who could fit into this rotation because look, right now, penciled in, we've got Grayson Rodriguez, we've got Zach Eflin. And then even from there, it's kind of some question marks. We know that Kyle Bradish is going to be out for the season already, and there's certainly some options. We saw Cade Povich pitch nicely down the stretch, but he still has a lot of question marks. There's Albert Suarez, who, of course, we don't really know what to expect. We still have Dean Kramer. Nikhil, you know what I think of Dean Kramer. He's a 5. He's nothing more. So look, there's spots to fill, and I don't think that we're going to get a Corbin Burns in free agency unless we get Corbin Burns. And I think going into next year, we are going to need Grayson Rodriguez to become our ace because I don't think anyone in free agency is an ace right now besides Burns. And even Burns might not be with the regression you were saying. We'll see. I mean, he probably will be in 25, but much farther after that, who knows?
Yeah, and I think, I love the way that you overviewed kind of the kind of top few tiers of the pitcher market because I think ideally this team signs a Bieber, Pivetta, Manea, one of those guys in the second or third tier of available starting pitchers. Signing two would obviously be great. Some of the older guys, maybe you might do one younger guy on a longer term deal, one older guy on a short term deal. But then there's still a bunch of names further down. Nathan Eovaldi is one I think that's been mentioned a few times about the around the Orioles recently. Matt Boyd, Andrew Heaney. These are all guys that would kind of fill out these rotation spots like you're talking about. It's no one really to get super excited about. I'd like Eovaldi just given his veteran status, postseason ability. But then it kind of thins out to some of these guys who would mainly you're trying to fill out your rotation on a short-term deal with them, which I don't think is necessarily a bad idea given what happened with the rotation last year with so many injuries. Getting a more proven option at your four might not be the worst idea if you're able to land a better option for your two. So then you're at Rodriguez, say Manea, then you have Eflin. And then you have, maybe it's Eovaldi, and you'd actually be able to feel pretty good about that four. And then five, you can figure out whether it's Povich. I don't know the injury status of everyone else coming off injuries last year, but there are options. So with all those options in mind, I guess, is there any of those kind of tier two, or high tier three guys that you would prefer? And then are there any targets that you would want as a veteran four guy? I really like Eovaldi for that, for example.
I like Eovaldi. I do think Eovaldi is probably going to be the most expensive veteran floor guy, and I know that you were kind of trying to put together like a bit of an ideal rotation where we get Minaya and Eovaldi, and I think that's going to be tough, man. Just because I think there's a lot of interest by a lot of teams that need pitching, and I think if we're going to end up with two solid new additions to this team, we're either going to need to overpay or we're going to need to make a trade. Because I would be really surprised if we ended up with two of those top like eight guys, like you were saying there. I mean, it's tough because I really did like some of the results that Sean Manaea ended up getting after that arm slot change. But I do think that some of the advanced statistics they don't really back up that he necessarily is like going to stay a solid two starter. I think that a lot of it may have been a bit of overperformance. I gotta say, I'm a little bit tantalized by Nick Pivetta, and I know that the qualifying offer is probably what's going to dissuade a team that's so driven by the draft like us. But man, I mean, he has an elite strikeout rate, and he doesn't walk that many guys either. So his K minus BB, which is a huge predictor for starting pitching success over the course of a season, is good, man. This guy could be a really good pitcher. And I think if we're talking about finding an ace in free agency, this guy's the closest thing that we might be able to find to that. And that's why Pivetta interests me. A lot of people were surprised he got offered a qualifying offer. The Red Sox knew this guy's got value and somebody's going to pay him. And that's why they gave it to him.
So okay, so we are talking about building this ideal rotation. So you land Pivetta. Are you still looking at, and I'm looking at a list right now, so some of these names are going to be a bit further down, but are you looking at basically trying to find an innings eater, a veteran innings eater? Um, or are you more comfortable going with, what we have, guys coming off of injury, Povich, whatever?
I
Because those
think
guys are expensive too. I mean, you might pay 15, $20 million a year to a veteran innings eater just because of this market.
it's something that we may be exploring via trade if we do end up. I think either way, if we end up with a veteran innings eater guy, maybe we go out and make a trade for someone with a bit of a higher ceiling and vice versa. Because I think if we go after Pivetta, the thing with Pivetta is that he has been a little bit banged up in seasons recently. He hasn't eclipsed 150 innings in either 2023 or 2024 for just nagging injuries, nothing too serious. But I mean, it seems like we can't necessarily rely on him if we were to sign him for the entirety of the season. I mean, somebody who seems like a really like buy low type of guy. I know the Diamondbacks have made it abundantly clear they have no interest in keeping Jordan Montgomery around. Look, it was a horrible season for Montgomery, and we do have Trevor Rogers, who might just be another Jordan Montgomery. I kind of forgot about that we even had him almost. I know he says he's up in drive line right now, getting his fastball velo up. So maybe Trevor Rogers will be an option next year. Um, so I mean, there's certainly options. I don't see us overpaying a low ceiling pitcher. That just doesn't really seem like how Michael Elias has operated, Nikhil. I don't think he's overpaid for that value. He's kind of given these light deals to Lyles and Gibson as just 1 year depth. I don't see us necessarily going on like a multi-year deal for somebody with a low ceiling.
Yeah, I think he buys low, looks for potential for positive regression from those 1 year guys. I think that's a great point. And I would rather the Orioles say, hey, we're gonna go out and overspend a little and get a number two. We're gonna go out and get Pivetta. And then then if you have to maybe have a couple guys audition for the 4 and 5 role between some youngsters and some older guys, there's ways to go about that. But I think if you go and just go for an innings eater and you don't add an impact arm, then it's really like, okay, we're just running back the last couple of years. So that's a lot of talk about pitchers. I'm trying to think if there are any other. I don't think there are any other starting pitcher names I wanted to mention. Um, we talked a little bit about the bullpen. Are there any relievers that you'd like to go out and get? I know there aren't a ton of like top names out there. I think Tanner Scott is probably um,
Oriole legend.
yeah, or legend Tanner Scott is probably the biggest free agent reliever out there. I'm running through my list once again here to double check. But he seems like the biggest name out there. There's Carlos Estevez, Clay Holmes, Kenley Jansen, a couple others further down. Are there any relievers that jump out to you in free agency, or are you kind of more looking for value, buying low on players, looking for, positive peripherals and regression?
Well, I think that first of all, everyone is going to be going after these top relievers. So that's just like with the starting pitching. There's going to be a bidding war, and those teams that don't get in on Soto or Burns, now they're like, okay, we need a relief ace. Because think about it, we listed what, like 5 teams that were in on Soto. Let me think. There was the Mets, the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Red Sox. People have been buzzing the Blue Jays. They're buzzing on the Blue Jays about Ohtani too. So I don't know how much I believe that. The Blue Jays probably should just trade Vlad and tank. But sorry, Blue Jays fans, that was a bit cruel. But anyways, Tanner Scott, look, he's the cream of the crop. And honestly, I gotta say, man, I really liked Tanner Scott when he was an Oriole. My thing about Tanner Scott was, dude, he has such incredible stuff. He just has no idea where it's going when he throws it. And we kind of just like dumped him off to the Marlins, and he ended up really finding it. And I gotta say, like, good for him because he always had it in him, and now he's finally figured it out, and he's going to get the big payday, which is awesome for him. I don't think that we're going to be the ones to get him because I think again the asking price is just going to shoot way up. But he was really, really awesome last year, and I think his demands are or his services are going to be highly in demand. Look, there's some solid options out there. I don't think you mentioned Jeff Hoffman. He had an excellent season
Mhm.
as a reliever for the Phillies, kind of in a setup role as well. Um, Great stuff jump, kind of a failed former starter. I think he was with the Rockies initially and kind of moved around a bit before landing with the Reds 2 years ago and really figuring it out as a reliever and then going to Philly, and he was awesome. He kind of seems like an option as a high leverage arm, but I do think really where we can navigate with the bullpen is kind of like those low ticket depth options. I don't know how much we necessarily need to go out and spend on the best of the best in the bullpen. Because thinking about our bullpen right now, I do think that we have some solid late inning options. Felix will be back. Obviously, you can't necessarily expect him to be the best reliever in baseball immediately coming off of Tommy John, but I think it is fair still to expect him to be our closer. We
Mhm.
know what Cano is. He's fine. He can be a middle to late inning guy. He's not going to be anything better than that probably, but he'll give us like a 3-ish ERA. I think he has good stuff. Dominguez, look, Dominguez as a setup man is fine. I think that he can miss bats. I'm sure he gave up some home runs, but he throws hard, solid setup man. And then as far as our lefty goes, you know that I have liked Gregory Soto's stuff. I think that there's something there for sure. He was a former All-Star closer with Detroit in 2021. So we have 4 hard throwing guys for these mid to late innings already who have all at some point or another proven to have good major league seasons. So now we can kind of look through, like you said, our machines that do influence our decisions, say, hey, who are some of these buy low guys who might be able to go out and get via trade or in free agency or on waivers? Or is Chase McDermott going to the bullpen? Is Albert Suarez going to be overflow into the bullpen? We have, I think, already some options for the pen. We just got to find out who these last, 2 to 3 ish guys are going to be. And I don't know if it's going to be a big ticket reliever unless we miss out on like all these starters we were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If you miss out on the starters, then obviously you got to fortify the bullpen because you might not have. you might not be able to put Kramer and Suarez in the bullpen if you need them in the rotation, which that would be a tough situation. The two other names I just want to throw at you for fun and free agency pitching before we go over to the bats, Verlander and Scherzer, both free agents. Um, Verlander has the history with Elias in Houston. Uh, I mean, to me, that's the lottery. To me, that might be like a lottery ticket veteran signing. That would be the kind of, three or four, third or fourth starting pitcher veteran signing I could get excited about because it's a lottery ticket, right? There are the injury issues, the fact that these guys are older, but at the same time, even in the last couple of years, they've still proven that they can morph right back into that shutdown pitcher on the mound. Not to mention all the postseason experience and just the seriousness and intensity that would bring to the rotation and the whole team. I'm not going out of my way to lure those guys. I think if you're selling them on the team, the culture, the chance to be a leader, all those things. You're not going out and trying to win a bidding war for Verlander or Scherzer. But do you have any thoughts on those two names, or are they just names to you?
I think something might have gone wrong if we end up with Verlander and or Scherzer. I think that means that we probably missed out on a lot in free agency. Oh, man, I mean Verlander looked kind of cooked last year, dude. I'm not gonna lie. He was pretty bad. And then he missed some time due to injury as well. Scherzer, maybe. I think Scherzer had a little bit better results last year, even though he also missed a lot of time. When he did pitch, I think he had better results, and he was still pretty solid in 2023 as well. I guess Scherzer mildly interesting as a fallback option, and for veteran leadership. Verlander, dude, I don't know. I think he might just not be very good anymore.
I looked it
He is
up, and
like 40. They're both
yeah,
40.
the peripherals for Verlander were pretty brutal last year. Scherzer, obviously barely pitched because he was injured, but didn't qualify for most of the peripherals. But if you just look at what they are, they're not bad given the small sample size. So I think I agree with that. I think Verlander is a name. I think Scherzer, you have more of a chance of wringing out, squeezing the last drop of, the beast of Max Scherzer out of him. But I just want to throw this at you because I figure you have
I got an idea for you. Ready? All right, here
yeah,
we go. We sign Max Scherzer. We don't use him until August. Then we let him loose. Maybe that's an idea.
you're just gonna have
If
Max
he's
Scherzer
willing to buy
stalking
in,
around the clubhouse, angry that he's not pitching. That would be, I mean, I think managing the key would be managing a guy like that and finding a way to, give him rest, but keep him in the rotation. It's tough. It's tough to do that. And you really have to sell them on the opportunity because those are not guys that I think the Orioles would overpay. Moving on to the lineup. Uh, from my view, I think most people's view, obviously losing Santander leaves a hole in the outfield. Um, the James McCann electing free agency means, the Orioles don't have a backup catcher for Adley, which I think, and I've been kind of pounding this drum for a couple years now. Having a solid backup for Adley is key. The splits when he catches versus doesn't catch are pretty severe. We saw how much the year just took a toll on him this year. And whether there was a specific injury or it was just all the wear and tear, we kind of saw that this year. And so having a guy in there that you can trust defensively, but maybe I know it's really tough. Pickings are really slim for catchers. But I think this is another area where you look for maybe a guy who's decent at defense and you see some projectable upside as a hitter at catcher. The name I like is Danny Jansen. I'm kind of biased towards Jansen just because I've always kind of loosely been a fan of his. I don't know if I could I can't even specifically say why, which is why I'm pointing out the bias. Um, you know, it's pretty solid history before 2024. Uh, the kind of guy that could catch plenty of games and let Adley get plenty of rest, plenty of DH at bats during the regular season, and even a guy that you might have DH a couple times when Adley's catching if he manages to rediscover some of his hitting form. Um, that's probably the name that jumps out to me. I don't think there aren't that many other particularly notable catchers. Yasmani Grandal, Travis d'Arnaud, Gary
I think Darno already
Sanchez.
signed.
D'Arnaud did sign. Kyle Higashioka. I mean, those are all guys, primarily defensive guys who aren't going to offer you much in the way of bats. Um, any particular catchers jump out at you? It's certainly not a high priority, um, but I guess it's just a little pet interest of mine.
Yeah, catching's been kind of going. I think Higashioka signed with the Rangers recently as well. So there's already been some catching off the market. And Higashioka had a pretty power. He had a career best in home runs last year with the Padres, I believe. He had kind of a breakout year, so he might have been a decent option. The Jansen shout is nice. I think he's a pretty good defender, at least a good blocker. I don't know necessarily if he's looking to be the number one catcher wherever he goes because he was pretty successful, like you said, before last year. He might be attempting to try and give himself one more chance to revitalize his career, even if that means latching on with more of a rebuilding type of team to kind of regain value. Something that I keep in mind with backup catching is that we did when we waived Mike Bauman in May, we ended up trading him to the Mariners for Blake Hunt, a catcher who I think was in their top 30 at the time, and he spent the whole year in Norfolk last year. He might be somebody that's on Elias's radar to potentially be the backup catcher if we don't necessarily get a veteran option. And we did bring in Robinson Chirinos to be our new bench coach. So it seems like he might be a pretty good mentor to another young backup catcher, especially with Basayo ascending and even possibly trending towards a debut in 2025. I think it's possible if we liked what we saw out of Hunt or shoot, I mean, Creed Willems was tearing it up in the fall league. Maybe we just throw him out there as the backup for a little and give him a shot shortly into the major league season to start this year. I don't think we're going to invest much into a backup catcher. You threw out some veteran names, all those. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever, you know. But I think ultimately we're hoping that by the end of 2025, probably either Hunt is our backup full time or Willems is our backup full time or Basayo was tearing it up. And now him and Adley are basically just sharing catching and DH responsibilities. I think that our goal is to find our resolution for backup catcher in house after the All-Star break this season.
I like that prediction. We're gonna come back to it on as the year progresses. Yeah, and I agree. I think but Basayo is a great point. Knowing you might have him come up this year, and at that point with Hunt with Willems, if they're not going to get a ton of at bats, that's okay. But if Basayo's up, ideally he's getting at bats, and that would mean that you kind of spent money on someone like Jansen, maybe to get you through the early part of the season. But at that point, it's tough to sell Jansen on what that vision would be in free agency because, like you said, he might be a little more desirable than some of the other guys out there. Um, Other than that, for the lineup, righty bat, particularly outfield, any names out there that you're particularly interested in? That's
Well,
not
I know
Juan Soto.
Teoscar is the one that's gotten a lot of buzz, but I think that he's going to he's going to be in pretty high demand. It's hard for me to say that, I really want us to go out and get like an impact right-handed bat, just because I do think, if we let Santander walk, which I think it's trending towards, we do let Santander walk, because Michael Elias did draft Heston Kjerstad second overall in the draft, and I think he would like to kind of see that out a little bit. He's been blocked for the past couple of years when he's been ready to go. I think if we don't bring back Santander, Kjerstad is going to be our opening day right fielder, and he is going to get consistent at bats all of the first half because I think we need to see what we got at the major league level in Kjerstad. We let Cowser show us what he got, and yeah, he's a better defender than Kjerstad, but Kjerstad was a tremendous hitter in AAA, and I don't think that we can just point to Santander leaving and say, yeah, we need a right-handed bat to fill that role because we don't have any more right-handers, and Kjerstad's a lefty. And while we do need more righties, I think that Kjerstad is likely as talented, at least, as anyone you would bring on, and he's cheaper and more controllable. So I don't know. I mean, we're gonna have some right-handers probably on the bench. I mean, there's not really a spot for Kobe Mayo right now, which almost leads me to believe that with Emmanuel Rivera being brought back, he might start the year in AAA again. So that we have a lot of right-handed options in the corner infield, and maybe we go out there and we sign like a slightly better Austin Slater because I know Austin Slater's off the market. He was number one priority to a major league team apparently. But I mean, I could see us maybe bringing on a fourth outfielder that's a bit of a lefty against lefties weapon who hits right-handed. But I don't really see us like dropping a lot of money on a Teoscar Hernandez because he's going to need a DH sometimes. And we kind of can't really promise him consistent DH at bats between Adley and our first base, overload of talent that we have there. So, look, we're not signing any infielders, and we need a fourth outfielder. And that's really it. And I think it's hard to sell a good right-handed hitter on being a fourth outfielder unless you just want to say screw it and trade Heston Kjerstad. But I think he would have done it by now if he wanted to trade Heston Kjerstad. He being Mike Elias, I mean. So that's kind of my thoughts. I don't think we're going to add anyone too impactful to the offense unless we just decide to ball out and bring Tony back.
Is there anyone out there that intrigues you? I mean, I know Hernandez is like the big name that's mentioned. Obviously, Tony, there's, Tyler O'Neill.
Right. I was kind of thinking of O'Neill just because he has some serious raw pop, but he has some health issues himself. I mean, he has not stayed healthy for a full season like at all recently. I know he's had 2021, I believe, and last year were both excellent seasons. Like last year, his on pace numbers were like ridiculous if he played a whole 162. He's a good player, but again, I trade Kjerstad then if we're going to do that. Like we can't keep Kjerstad and just have him not play.
And I think again, you hit it exactly right on the head earlier when you said no player that you can bring in, um, you know, has maybe the upside that Kjerstad has, certainly for much more money. And then you have to give them the at bats to take away from Kjerstad because it is a zero-sum game. And again, it takes away resources from going after starting pitching. I could see, an outfield bat or righty bat maybe be a pivot if they're only, if maybe they only land one mid-level starting pitcher, maybe they pivot to go at a bat. But you get down further down, and it's names like Max Kepler, Paul Goldschmidt, nothing to get that excited about. And I'm not sure either of those two guys. The only reason that maybe a guy like Kepler might make a little sense is because maybe you don't have to play him every day. I think there's kind of two schools of thought, which is, well, you're paying him to play, so he should play. But I think if you are, as light of a payroll as the Orioles do, you could go out and pay a little bit more for a veteran guy who maybe doesn't play more than 100 games. Just because you're not spending that much money on the guys who are playing. So you might as well shore up the reserves where you can, and that way you're still getting those developmental snaps or at bats for Kjerstad. Still very much in football brain. The last question I had was if there are any trade targets out there that you had any interest in. The one I know when we were talking about this before the show started, I mentioned Luis Castillo, a name that was brought up at the deadline and has been brought up again this offseason, largely because the Mariners, I almost said Seahawks, the Mariners badly need hitters. They badly need young hitters. It's a potential spot for like even a veteran trade if the Orioles are maybe interested in moving Ryan Mountcastle, which has been something that's been talked about a good bit too. He could be involved in the deal, obviously, probably along with another, couple prospects for Castillo. But the Mariners have so much young controllable starting pitching talent. I don't know what Luis Castillo's contract is. I think that's the only name that I could really think of as a guy that I would say, oh, let's explore this. Obviously, there are plenty of options out there. But the trouble with that, like you mentioned when we were starting this before we started the podcast, is that a lot of teams go into the offseason thinking they're going to compete and win, and so they're less willing to give up pitching. Castillo, by the way, has $24.15 million salary over the next 3 years, plus a vesting 25 million in 2028. So that's the other problem is it's for big money, but he is controllable, and that raises his value to the Mariners.
Yeah, like we were talking about it, it's all just hearsay when we're talking about trades. I mean, neither of us have a man on the inside feeding us information. We're just speculating. Crochet is certainly an exciting entity, I guess you could say. I mean, look, he was absolutely outstanding this past season. Looked like one of the most dominant pitchers in baseball. But the White Sox are going to want a big haul, and I don't even know if necessarily the Orioles are the best positioned team anymore. We don't have the best farm system in the MLB anymore. So, we would really have to kind of make our bid more appealing to teams than it used to be when we were kind of just coming off of this rebuild and we were like, hey, we got everything you want. You just tell us. It's like, no, now we kind of have to pitch our farm to a team like the White Sox because the Red Sox have an incredibly talented farm system right now, and they're motivated to add pitching because they already had good hitting last year, and none of these hitters were even on their team yet. So they
Hmm.
certainly are looking to add to their pitching through trade, and they might be the team that's kind of the best fit for a trade for Crochet. So I really do just have a hard time believing that we're going to be able to get Crochet without having to give up a Mayo or a Kerstad. And I think it would be Mayo because Kerstad's already kind of old, and I don't think he really fits the White Sox timeline. And I just don't know if I'm willing to do that, especially with the injury history that he's had. It seems a little bit risky. If they do want to go for like a Bradfield or a Honeycutt centered package, sure, I'm in. Let's do that. But I don't really know if I want to give up anything that's super close to the major league level that's looking like an impact player. I remember last year there was some discussion around Jesus Luzardo as a potential trade candidate, and he is still in Miami, and Miami is still trending towards being one of the worst teams in baseball this year again. I'm sorry, Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers, we love you, but it's not looking good for your team this year. And it was a rough year for Luzardo, so he might be a bit of an interesting buy low, especially now that he's, I think, only down to 2 more years of team control. He had an excellent year, either 23 or 22. He was very, very good. He was also a highly touted prospect on his way through the, I believe, A's farm system. And he's a lefty. So he's somebody that could be an option and probably wouldn't be as expensive as a Garrett Crochet. And maybe, let's just get another Marlins pitcher at drive line and see if him and Trevor Rogers can figure out their troubles together.
Yeah, yeah, I think, starting with Crochet, I think it's a combination of not just trading for him, but he's made it pretty clear his desire for, a big money extension that you then have to contend with. Um, I know they traded for Burns, but Burns seemed really intent on hitting free agency. Crochet seems to really want to get his contract and settle somewhere, whether that's Chicago, who isn't going to pay him, or someone else. Um, so yeah, Luzardo is another interesting name out there. I think again, the theme that we've been throwing around is buy low because I think that's something that this front office has demonstrated as a strength is their ability to find players who have been cast off by another team for one reason or another, who are having a down year, who maybe have some minor technical issue that the Orioles think they can address and really pull the best out of them. But when you're focusing all your resources and potentially becoming willing to overpay on a starting pitcher, this is where you end up in other places when you're not, the Yankees and the Dodgers and the coffers aren't literally bottomless. There is some resource scarcity the Orioles have to deal with, and so spots like catcher, relief pitcher, and even adding to the lineup all feel like significantly lower priorities than really putting out big money for a starting pitcher. I'm trying to think if there are any other, major notes of this offseason. There's nothing really big for the Orioles to react to yet, like we talked about,
We moved the
releasing.
wall in.
That's true. We did move the wall in, moving the left field wall. I forget exactly how much, but rest in peace, Baltimore from,
I'm
was that
not super happy.
2022 to 2024, and now it's Baltimore Junior, I guess. Um, yeah, I guess, I think the front office kind of said it was an overcorrection and, the numbers they analyzed. I think players like, Mountcastle lost a ton of home runs there. Why aren't you happy?
I don't love that they're just leaving this empty void in between where the wall was and where the new
Oh, the
wall is. They're not
design.
replacing the seating. And so I'm kind of just wondering, what is this going to do to the aesthetic of the park we love? I mean, I was talking about this actually recently, and I think so. This was my brother. He came up with a really good suggestion. Actually, he said maybe we could put in like some move the ground up and kind of put in like some flower beds in that area. That might be a nice aesthetic add to the stadium because if it's just going to be like this empty space in between the two walls, like ugh, it's going to look terrible.
They're probably going to put ads there.
You think?
That's, I mean, just that is, that is probably what has the biggest like highest odds of happening. Just given not just, and this is not an Orioles specific thing. I mean, they did go they put the T row sign up. They got the patch. I mean, but it's something that I mean across all sports, but especially baseball, we're seeing is just get as many ads in as everywhere as you possibly can. Digitally project an ad onto the freaking starting pitcher's mound, which drives me crazy whenever I see that. So I mean, I really like your brother's idea of getting some foliage, some greenery in there. There's definitely things
Put
that you
the
can
ads
do.
above the flowers. The flowers would look nice, I think, in that
Yeah,
empty
you could put
space.
the I think you put the ads on the wall where the void area is, and I think flowers would be a really neat design choice there. But yeah, it's an interesting move. I find it ceaselessly funny that Major League Baseball teams can just change the dimensions of their field willy-nilly. I'm sure I've brought it up on here before, but there are a few times that I've laughed harder than when the Orioles moved back their right field wall and then spent 3 straight years with first round picks on power lefties. Just really quality bit there by the front office. I applaud it. Committing to it, absolutely. But I think that's about all we have for our episode today, Daniel. It's great to get back together with you. And yeah, we'll keep doing these off-season episodes as the off-season progresses. Probably closer to once every few weeks, but obviously when anything big happens in Baltimore, we will be right on it to bring you the latest news and reactions. Daniel, any parting thoughts?
Just stick with us throughout the off season. You can find Baltimore Birdwatchers on YouTube, on Spotify, other places where you stream. We're going to be coming at you with more news as it happens. We are locked in on the Orioles. React to this news with us. Please listen in, subscribe to us if you're on YouTube or like us on Spotify. Keep us around on your phone. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, and definitely check us out on X as well. I'm at Nick Nik knows ball and Daniel Orioles, Maryland Terrapin sports in general over at drot_6. Also an excellent fantasy baseball writer. If there's anyone out there that needs some tips for their team next year. With that, thanks so much for joining me, Daniel, and thank you to everyone who tuned in.
1,